This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 32. Hi there and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 32, Persian Language Under the Ayatollahs. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We're coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 31 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 32. We often talk about the way Iran has changed in the last half century and the concomitant changes those of us who are of Iranian descent, inside and outside of Iran, have experienced as well. But what about something as simple as the words we speak and the way that we speak them? The Islamic Revolution of 1979 created seismic shifts in Iranian society, infrastructure, culture, politics, economy. But what effect did it have on language? How has the Persian lexicon and vernacular changed since the period of the Shah? And what impact did the Islamic Republic's attempts to Islamize the primary language in Iran have on the way Persians speak? To address these questions, I'm joined today by a linguist who has studied such matters very closely. Dr. Khatereh Sheibani is an Iranian-Canadian scholar, author, and curator of Iranian cinema and Persian literature and culture. She received her master's degree in linguistics from the University of Tehran and her doctorate in comparative literature and film studies at the University of Alberta. Dr. Sheibani's book, entitled The Poetics of Iranian Cinema, Aesthetics, Modernity, and Film After the Revolution, was published in 2011. She has written numerous pieces on modern Persian literature and Iranian and Middle Eastern cinema in literary and film periodicals such as Iranian Studies and the Canadian Journal of Film Studies. She's also established multiple courses in Persian studies at York University in Toronto, where she is a professor in the humanities department. And right now, Dr. Khatereh Sheibani joins me from Toronto, Canada. Hello.
Hello, Mr. Ghomeshi. Thank you for the kind introduction.
Thank you so much for being on this program. Please call me Jian, and I really appreciate that you're doing this with us. I want to get into how the Persian language has shapeshifted in the last half century and certainly since and because of the Islamic Revolution. But first, I know one thing that linguists often remind us of is that language never remains static. So, in other words, revolution or not, I guess we might expect that the Persian language will have changed in the last 5 decades, yes?
Yes, definitely. Language is dynamic. If language becomes static, at that moment, that language is dead. We have some artificially preserved languages nowadays, like Latin, like Sanskrit, like Old Persian, but they are dead because basically they are static. They are frozen in the time they were used to be spoken by language users. But a live language like modern Persian is dynamic. It's like a living thing. It evolves with time.
So it follows to say that in general, not only should we not be fearful of change in language, but we should embrace it as a measure of a dynamic language. Is that
Definitely,
as a general
yes.
rule, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
With that said, again, if you can give me a general answer to begin with, because we'll obviously get into specifics, do you believe, notwithstanding that language is fluid, that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 had a direct impact on the Persian language?
The short answer is yes. Yes, the Islamic Republic had an impact on language, both directly by state policies that were implemented after the Islamic Revolution, and also by the way people responded to such ideological decisions made about language. So, yes.
Interesting. So it's not just the way the state dictates it, it's the response to the state that can shift the language as well.
Exactly. Language users are not just receivers of certain linguistic patterns. I mean, other than the state, when a new medium of communication is introduced, like radio, for instance, or television or cinema, all of these media, they also brought new linguistic patterns. Some of them were accepted by people, some of them were not accepted, and even some of them were used ironically because people ridiculed that certain linguistic patterns that were used. So going back to the changes made by the Islamic regime from the Pahlavi era, it's important to be reminded of the changes that were made during the Pahlavi era, because language was a means to introduce modernity to Iranians.
Right. I was going to say, I mean, our focus is what happened after the Islamic Revolution, but even going back to the Constitutional Revolution and thereafter in Reza Shah, there was an effort to Persianize the language first, right? I mean, over the course of the 20th century. Do you want to actually speak to that briefly before I ask you about the categories of how we assess change? Yeah.
Before even I go into this, I should mention that in any language is directly related to thought, to thinking. And when people's thinking and people's way of perceiving the outside world changes, their language will also change accordingly. So when Iranians, they had this aspiration for more freedom of thought and expression during the Constitutional Revolution. And as a result, I think there were new linguistic patterns that were used by authors, by poets such as Malik al-Shu'ara Bahar or Iraj Mirza or Arif Qazvini. The constitutionalist poets started using a simple everyday language that was more accessible to people by de-Arabizing the language, that by not using those, very sophisticated Arabic words that normal people didn't know what they meant. And that resulted in the revival of Maktab Khorasani, the Khorasani movement in Persian poetry. So they called themselves the revivalists.
Can you give an example of that? I mean, as we go through this, we'll obviously be using Persian terms that we can then translate into English. But what's an example of simplifying the language as you de-Arabize it?
So, for instance, these poets started to read more of classical works such as Shahnameh. By going back to Shahnameh, they started to dig in words that were used in Shahnameh and then use them. These ideas of de-Arabizing was also supported by Reza Shah. During the first Pahlavi era, they initiated the Farhangistan Zaban و Adab Farsi, the Academy of Persian Language and
Right.
Literature, to basically what they meant to do to the so-called cleansing Persian language further.
It occurs to me when we talk about change in language, I mean, I'm going to impose on you to do a bit of a very, very simple and quick linguistics lesson for us, that because I know change is kind of an omnibus term, but it can mean a few different things. You've outlined that there are a number of ways we can observe changes in language. So if I can walk you through just some of them, and maybe you can give us examples of what you've observed in the case of Persian language. First of all, I mean, quite simply, we can note change in phonology. That's the sound of words, right? What does that mean?
Yeah. Phonological changes means we have sound patterns in language, and sometimes phonological take place, but they take place less often. That's one of the most conservative patterns of almost any language, but especially in Persian.
And would we have seen any of that in the last few decades?
We have seen very little, and the changes in phonology are very gradual and over centuries rather than decades. You see phonological changes. If you consider the three main dialects of Persian that are Farsi, that is being used by Iranians, Tajiki, used by people of Tajikistan, and also Dari, Farsi Dari, that's used by people of Afghanistan. We see more phonological changes in sound patterns in Iran. For instance, this use of semi-vowels like aw in Raushan, in Naw. Naw means new. We don't have that semi-vowel anymore in the Persian used by Farsi speakers in Iran. So we say no.
Nowruz instead of Nowruz. Right.
Nowruz. It's Nowruz. It used to be. But we don't say Nowruz anymore. We say Nowruz. So we simplified it.
What about spelling? What do changes in spelling, the spelling of words, represent, and where might we see that?
So sometimes we see spelling and dictation changes. This is also done less frequent in especially formal or written language, but you see more frequent changes in the spoken form. So you might say we don't write the spoken form, but I can say yes, we do. This spoken form or the informal language is used in media, social media. I mean, when I say write to my mom in Iran in WhatsApp, I use that language to write my message.
So I guess the biggest or main category would be lexical changes in language, changes in the very lexicon. What is an example of that? I mean, I'm going to get into what happened after the revolution, but just an example in the case of Persian of how the lexicon has changed over the last half century.
Right. Yes, the lexical changes are happening more frequent, and this area is the most playful part of language in Farsi. I don't want to go too theoretical, but one of the reasons is that Persian is a synthetic language. So we generate new words by adding, for instance, suffix or prefix to the verb or noun stem. And this is partially because of generational transition.
Right.
So from generation to generation, they tend not to use the language that was used by their parents.
Right.
So for instance, the new words that are also new to me, like antenn. Antenn is like antenna. It means Adam furush, the person who spies on others.
Oh.
So that word
antenn.
is antenn. میگن طرف antenn.
That's a totally new word?
That's a rather new word. I didn't heard it before. Or, before, maybe in my generation, the word for used in slang word for a beautiful woman, maybe a little bit sexist also, I should say, was hulu, like peach. This woman looks like hulu. But these days they use other words like doff.
Tough, yeah.
Yeah, doff and puff. Puff is
right.
refers
Yes.
to men,
Yes.
and doff. Or, back then when a person looked, not very, it looked like a person who had just come from a smaller, remote place, not as sophisticated or doesn't know the social etiquette of urban places. They were called, for instance, dohati or ozgal. Nowadays, they use different terms. They call them Jawad or Khaz.
I didn't know Javad meant Dehati. I thought there was nuances.
Jawad is a proper name. It's a male name, right?
Right.
So میگن they might say طرف خیلی جواده. یعنی this person is not doesn't know the social etiquette.
Right. But if I were to say Javad to my mother's generation, they wouldn't necessarily
possibly they may not understand it.
Or they certainly wouldn't have used it 40, 50 years ago. Right?
No.
So you finally there are semantic changes. Just give me an example of how semantic changes happen with the Persian language.
Every word is loaded with meaning for any given generation, for any given community. The semantic connotation of these words sometimes change with socio-political changes. For instance, farajenahi. Farajenahi in Persian means beyond party. That was a term used initially by authorities in Islamic Republic for people who wanted to reconcile the more fundamentalist groups with the reformists. They called themselves farajenahi.
Okay.
Like, we are the people who could work and have dialogue beyond parties. So nowadays, farajenahi is used in an ironical, way by people. Like the person who could adapt to, for their own, benefit, could adapt to different ways of life, could be friends with everyone.
Right.
The person who doesn't have principles, moral principles.
So the word itself has shapeshifted to mean something, I guess, more pejorative, in fact.
To poke fun of the terminology used by Islamic Republic, people of Islamic Republic.
I see. So there's that element too, that it's
exactly. Or the word, for instance, cactus. Cactus is a type of plant, right?
Yes.
So when these days the younger kids, I call them kids because they are teens, and so the kids see a مأمور انتظامی, a cop, right? Mm-hmm. They say there is a cactus there.
Why cactus?
Example, because they have thorns, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating.
They might say they are in خیابان گاندی, مثلا they are in Gandhi Street.
Yes.
And they might say, beware, if you are going to Jordan Street, there is a cactus there.
That's
or
fascinating.
there is a car full of cactus.
Let me come back to cactus, because I want to ask you where these words actually emerge from. But let me get back to, I appreciate that you've tried to, in a expeditious way, take us through some of the ways that linguists actually assess change. So you talked about the fact that despite the fact that language is fluid, we established that, and dynamic, that there were political and ideological ideological elements to shifts in Persian language that came with the Islamic Revolution. So there was a stated mission and expectation of the power elite of the Islamic Republic to Islamize the Persian language.
Exactly.
What
Yes.
would that mean?
In the early 80s to early 90s, there was a very systematic effort done by, authorities to Islamize the language by coining new lexicon and by changing the semantic connotations of existing words and idioms. Also, they were using media such as radio and television that were state-controlled
Yes.
to popularize words related to religion and Islam.
Okay.
And also in Islamized film industry and what they called Cinéma Difاع Muqaddas, a war genre of war movies that were state-funded and state-supported. They were using these terms. Like always, the good person in a movie, Islamized movie, was called Haji. Haji was the good person.
Which is actually a term for someone who's traveled to Mecca.
To Mecca.
That's tantamount to a good person all of a sudden.
And then the villains of the movies or in TV series were normally, they had pure Persian names. Like Siavash. Siavash was the smuggler.
Wow.
Or Shahriyar was the thief. Or,
So there was an active attempt to demonize Persian names?
Exactly.
To what end? What would they gain from making Siavash a bad person's name?
Because all of a sudden, from the time of constitutional revolution up to Islamic Republic, Iranians were seeing themselves as a nation. We had nationalist ideals. And all of a sudden, there was a change. I mean, the government, the Islamic Republic, wanted to change the idea of millat or nation to ummat, to Islamic nation.
Right.
So they wanted to sort of construct the idea of we are Ummul Qura. That even the word is Arabic. We are the mother of all Islamic countries. So this transition from millat to ummat had to be implemented by encouraging people to use Arabic words for their children.
Well, language would become fundamental, when you want to create that much of a change. And I mean, it's like Khmer Rouge, it's like Cambodia, it's like year zero. We're going to erase everybody's memories and restart, right? That language becomes a big part of that.
Yeah. For quite a while, the statistics department, they had a list of names approved by the government that you could use for your children when you were trying to get the birth certificate.
Wow.
Yes, exactly. That's quite crazy. So for quite a while, the male name Shahriyar was not permitted by Idare Sabt Ahwal, and it was quite arbitrary. So you had to try. I remember when I was going to, I was in the hospital, so my husband went to get the birth certificate from Idare Sabt Ahwal. We had a few names in case one of them was not allowed. We could use the next one.
So presumably names like Ali and Muhammad are okay, right?
Always,
right.
They were encouraged. And the more people resisted to this ridiculous idea of, watching movies in which all the bad guys have Iranian names and all the good guys have Arabic names, eventually they had to respond. I mean, the film industry had to respond. So now there is a change.
So beyond film, I mean, how First of all, on the street, as they say, how effective was this attempt to? I mean, before we get to the way the defiance or resistance to this has affected language, just on a simple level, how effective was this attempt to Islamize the Persian language? I mean, did in those first 10 years after the revolution, the Persian language in Iran become more Arabic, more Islamic?
It became more Islamic in the first decade, for sure, because, for several reasons. People were still in shock. I mean, we had more serious problems to deal with. One of them was an 8-year war and the aftermath of the war we had to deal with. And also many people lost their jobs because of the revolution. There was a fundamental change. The upper class were almost diminished, and the people from rural areas and less educated got certain, very key roles in society.
Right.
So, I mean...
because they represent less of a threat, because they are less intrinsically tied to the old sort of elite, including the language, right?
The oppressed became the oppressor. In a way. I mean, layer of social strata that was called mustazafin, the oppressed. They became the oppressors. They got key roles in Komite Emdad, Sepah Pasdaran. They went to war. After a few years in war, they came back as war veterans. And they had a certain social status.
And they have status, both cultural and presumably economic, certainly political, to be gained by using a more Islamic language.
By using more Islamic words.
Right.
And those Islamic terminology, for instance, one of the terms they used was taghut و taghuti. Taghut, if you go to Farhang De Khoda or De Khoda dictionary, you are going to see there are different meanings associated with taghut. Taghut is a word, a Quranic word, I believe, meaning evil, related to Satan, satanic, or it means also magician or oppressor. So when they would confiscate someone's house, say, for instance, the singer Gugush, people might have said, why this house is confiscated? They might have said, this house belonged to a taghuti.
Wow.
So for a while, I think people were using this terminology, or the term paksazi, to cleanse a system from basically the professionals. They call it paksazi,
which is actually a very scary term.
It is.
I mean, cleansing is, the whole idea is deeply offensive, but that becomes commonplace to use that kind of term?
It became to some extent commonplace. I remember my parents coming from work. So my mom looked horrified and she was in complete shock, and she said, oh, today this person was paksazi shod. So that we knew that this person is not retired, or she didn't quit her job, or, whatever. She was cleansed out of the system.
But Dr. Sheibani, when there's a political dimension to the language that is allowed and not allowed after the revolution, it also occurs to me, it means renaming certain words or activities to the level of absurdity. So, for example, dancing was banned after the revolution. It's still problematic in Iran. So then they face an issue with what happens to the actual word for dance, because they don't want to encourage anybody to dance. So explain what happens in that. I mean, I happen to know this one where if it wasn't so heartbreaking, it's really quite funny. So it's comedic that they're twisting themselves in circles to change the lexicon, right? So what happens to dance?
Dance is now called, in the more formal language used in even a secular literary magazine, right, in Iran. I'm not going to name any of them, but they have to call it harakat mawzun, like balanced movements rather than dance, because dancing is supposedly decadent, and it's related, I mean, quite outrageously. For some time, they considered dancing equivalent to, I mean, certain activities like drinking, gambling, prostitution.
Right. But I think, almost as mad as it is to ban dancing, almost worse is to not even be able to say the word. I mean, it's quite. Would it have gone to the extent where if you're out on the street, you're not even allowed to say raqs? You're not allowed to say the word for dance.
On the street, one of the major ways for Iranians to get some form of psychological relief is talking politics on the streets, and middle class, normal neighborhood in Tehran, for instance, in Yusufabad, in Vanak, in, I don't know, Abbasabad, in Velenjak. It's quite normal for people to express their concern and their disagreement with governmental decisions. So, I mean, going back to the word dance, no, of course they were using the word raqs. I mean, the term harakat mawzun looked quite funny,
Right. And so there's words like dance or the word for alcohol that they didn't want to use because they've banned these things. Then there's words like Shah, which also became problematic. And here you've got, I mean, cities, towns named with the word Shah in them.
Exactly.
What was the thinking around banning the word Shah?
At the beginning, once again, in the early 80s up to early 90s, this term Shah was the maybe most problematic word or term they were trying to fight with. For instance, you mentioned the name of some cities in Iran. For instance, Shahrud. Shahrud was initially called Aram Shahr. Then it was called Islam Shahr because people hated the name Aram Shahr. Then they called it Islam Shahr. They hated it even more. They called it Imam Shahr. And eventually, people of Shahrud said, look, we have great icons belonging to Shahrud. They were from Shahrud. Shahrud was Shahrud from the very beginning of its history. So we don't like that name. Or the name of the city Kermanshah. It was changed to Kahramanshah first, the city of heroes, and then it was changed to Bakhtaran. And eventually they had to, I mean, because they saw the civil resistance, they had to go back to Kermanshah. But in some other cases, people, I guess, accepted that name in some other places, such as Shahi. That's a city in northern Iran by the Caspian Sea. So it is Qaim Shahr.
What was our very first episode of this series, we talked about the transformation of Meydan Shahyad into Meydan Azadi, and how a symbol that the same building, the same structure, the same place can shapeshift overnight in terms of, and part of that was the renaming of it, of course. But that is an obvious building that is, or monument that is built as in dedication to the King of Kings, etc. With these other words that happen to have Shah in them, what was the actual? Where was the regime coming from on this? Was it just we want to erase any memory of the Shah, so we don't want the word said? I mean, how would they legitimize this? Going through an obstacle course to change the names of cities.
I guess it showed how much they felt threatened by the idea of maybe a coming back of a royal system in Iran. maybe. I mean, Reza Shah, his formal name was Reza Shah. He was the Shah of Iran, and his name was Reza Shah. I remember after the revolution, all of our books, in Persian books, in history books, Persian literature books, and so forth, the name Reza Shah was changed to Reza Khan Mirpanj, instead of Reza Shah Pahlavi.
Right.
Even they were not using the term Shah for the previous dynasty, the Qajar kings, for a while. Muhammad Reza, he was called Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was called in our books initially Muhammad Reza. I mean, which Muhammad Reza? You know?
Right. Right. For just practically, it makes less sense. So, I mean, in the same way that a ban on alcohol or dance has ultimately been a failure, people are going to do what they do. So is the case with a ban on language, because as you intimated earlier, and as I want to segue us into now, how has resistance or defiance of this current government regime in Iran affected the Persian language?
Exactly. Just the way you see civil disobedience on the street level, with the fashion choices, women especially, but also men, make these days. You see the on the linguistic level, you see this civil disobedience. I have friends who are from Bandar Anzali or Bandar Pahlavi. That's a city in Iran. So I have seen more and more my friends from Anzali or Pahlavi call it Pahlavi once again. You know, it's a like a form of resistance. Or nowadays the term Haji that was used to, in Iranian television to show this very pious, very mystical character was called Haji. Now this term sometimes is used ironically to poke fun of, a person who is a hypocrite, who tries to look in a way that he doesn't look. He's not in reality. Also, among the marginalized groups, we see that resistance among, for instance, the LGBTQ community of Iran.
Right.
For instance, the term degarbash. Degarbash means a person who has different sexual tendencies, different sexual orientation, but it doesn't look like a pejorative term.
So presumably the terms one is using, whether it's to describe someone's sexual orientation or the town they live in, I live in Pahlavi or whatever, is a way of situating them politically, or to suggest I'm not with the program here with this regime.
Exactly. For instance, for quite a while, since the beginning of the revolution, they were trying to produce more what they called the so-called soldiers of Islam. Reproduction has been, encouraged by the clerics from the very beginning of the revolution. They wanted to have more I don't know exactly why, because people are suffering economically, but they want to have more. Reproduction is, and there is a resistance not only that, but also to marriage. While marriage as a religious institution was encouraged, now that religious aspect is taken away in ازدواج سفید, in white marriage.
Right.
They feel committed to one another, but they don't want to have that religious certificate,
What are the implications for language with that?
For language, the terminology, they use now a new term for that. ازدواج, yes, it's ازدواج, but it's not the traditional ازدواج you were talking about. Mine is ازدواج سفید.
Right, white marriage, right.
Yeah.
How do we, Dr. Sheibani, we've had a number of people who've come on this show who've talked about an increase in the use of English words being integrated into the contemporary Persian vernacular in Iran. And this is an interesting development because, on the face of it, certainly people who are not Iranian or don't study Iran would think, well, there's challenged relations between Iran and the West. And so the last thing they would expect is for English to be making its way into the Persian vernacular. How do we make sense of that? And where does that fit in with these changes and the resistance, etc.?
Yeah. In generally speaking, any culture that finds popularity in an external culture, in an external community, would bring linguistic patterns with that culture. When, for instance, say in medieval era in Iran, people who considered themselves as the learned, the literati, they would use more Arabic words because it looked more complicated. It showed that they have better education, for instance.
Some level of sophistication.
Some level of sophistication. And then you come to 18th century and 19th century and the introduction of French literature by French translators, because among the very first Iranians who went abroad to study, they went to France. So French became this language of prestige for the learned people. Even up to the generation of my parents, they used terms such as agrandissement, rendezvous, prestige داره این کار prestige داره میدونید and so forth. And then English language is nowadays the dominant language in pop culture. There is no dispute about that.
Right, it's the lingua franca of the world.
Yeah. And then Iranian kids are also in the middle class society, from Islamabad to Tehran to Istanbul. They use English words to show not only a level of sophistication, but also to show that, yes, I know Kanye West. I have heard this rap music. I know this person. I am familiar with that movie, Hollywood movie, that Netflix movie.
But surely that's not, I'm guessing that's not looked upon fondly by the current government in Iran.
Of course not. Also, on another level, it goes back to the idea of defiance.
Right. It's a thumbs up. It's a thumbing of the nose towards the authorities. Right. Here I am using English words. You can't contain me. F you. Right.
Earlier, after revolution, English books in our school system were getting smaller and smaller, and then Arabic books were getting, more, substantial. That also comes with resistance because they wanted to impose more Arabic words, and the more they imposed those Arabic words, the more people tried to use loan words coming from English, the language that was despised by government.
Right. Loan words, right. Mm-hmm. You've said that shifts in the Persian language, like this, for example, like the adoption of English words, or like the semantic changes, or like the new words that have been, I'm coming back to cactus. You just wait. I've got to ask you about cactus. But you've said these shifts in Persian language almost always come from within Iran rather than, say, from the diaspora. Why is that the case?
In any diasporic community, given diasporic community, but including the Iranian diaspora, we get frozen in time when we left the country. So some of us, I came in the 90s here, 1990s, and then I saw people who came in the 70s, and I thought that they were frozen in time, and possibly some might think that I am also frozen in the 90s, people who are now coming from Iran.
Do you
So
notice
in
that?
a
Do
way,
you notice that you speak differently from an Iranian immigrant in Toronto who would have come, say, 5 years ago?
I am a linguist, so I try to use the more common. So in my case, I try to keep abreast with the
Right. You're on top of
linguistic.
things. Right.
I try to, but at the same time, there is this generational gap. But yeah, I mean, going back to cactus,
No,
another
hang on.
term.
I'll get to cactus. Yeah, I've got to ask you specifically. But this it's so interesting because it plays out in funny ways in sometimes. In that, I don't even know if I would fairly say that I'm completely fluent in Persian. I mean, I can carry a conversation, but some of the sophisticated language I have trouble with, even if I understand it. And yet there's regularly a moment amongst the Roqe team or, my colleagues here when I'm speaking Persian, because they say, well, where did you learn this word from? You're coming up with some crazy word that hasn't been used in decades. And it's because I learned my Persian from my dad and my mom. And, my dad left Iran in the 60s. I mean, they came to Canada in the 70s. So I'm speaking really a Persian that my dad would have learned in the 1940s and 50s in Iran, this, which is like an outdated kind of tongue, right? And yet to me, that's Persian. And so I'm trying to mix that in with somebody who's come from Mashhad a year ago. So it's a very interesting insight into how this language is elastic, I guess, like all languages.
Exactly. Also, I mean, something that is used as a bridge between us, the Iranian community outside of Iran, with the people who live inside is social media nowadays.
Right.
So because, I mean, quite interestingly, when blogging was introduced in the internet, the Iranian bloggers were positioned number 4 of all languages. After English, I believe Spanish, Portuguese, if I'm not mistaken.
But certain platforms become more urgent because it's a difficult, because communication is difficult with folks in Iran in some ways. So currently, I would say that of the moment is Clubhouse, that a platform that really has already died for most of the rest of the world. English people barely use it, but it's very, very popular and dynamic still in the Persian space because it's uniting people from within Iran and outside of Iran. So let me come back to cactus because on a previous call with you, I was actually talking to you about the word khafan, which means, I think, means cool, right? Or something.
Yeah, right.
So this is about 2 years ago. A social media influencer said to me, she said, you know what, if you really want to sound up to date, you start calling things that you think are cool khafan, and but I mean, the funny thing is that a couple of people, my mom's age that I mentioned the word to, they'd never heard of it. They don't even know what that is, right? So this is clearly something that has emerged, and I'm guessing emerged out of Iran within the last few years. I mean, when did khafan start? Do you know?
I think the first time I heard it was back in 2003 or 2005.
Okay.
Around that time, I heard that.
So it's a 21st century word, right?
Exactly.
So my question to you is, where does a word like khafan or cactus, where do these words come from, and how do they become devoid of a media within Iran that can be spreading these words around, because obviously you're not going to hear khafan or cactus on national Iranian radio and television. How do they emerge as regular parts of the lexicon?
Back before, I think, social media was born, it was normally comedians or authors of a certain degree of popularity. They used to coin new words in Persian. Also, radio had a place, and television. There was a program called Sobh Jum'e ba Shoma, and it was a comedy, and terminology used by those groups were also used among, or I mean, certain TV series such as Daijan Napel on,
Right.
San Francisco for sexual discourse, or terms that were used in Daijan Napel on. But nowadays, that sort of position is taken by more innovative and creative language users in social media. So they either coin those terms or they popularized those terms.
So the cactus, to refer to a cop, is something that somebody would see in social media?
In social media. Also, another term for cops in Iran is felfel sabz, the green pepper.
The green pepper.
Felfel sabz or cactus, depending how, serious that person is,
You mentioned sexual discourse a moment ago, and I wanted to ask you about that before I let you go. I want to ask you about taboo words, taboo language, or more underground language. This would seem like an obvious one after the revolution, that talk about sex or language about sex and sexuality would be problematic, and this is sort of a double whammy because it's also difficult in a highly patriarchal society anyway. So what has been the fate of talk about sex in the last 43 years after the revolution?
On one level, some of your listeners might say that this patriarchal system made talking about sex and also not only sex but also gender relations quite difficult. It was taboo. On another level, I should also say that Persian is a language that is enriched by jokes that are sexually oriented too, So, take a look at Obeid Zakani, the poet Obeid Zakani, and the work that he produced in the medieval era. And you see so many sexual jokes in that book. Take a look at Iraj Mirza's poetry belonging to Constitutional Revolution, and also to the book Daijan Napel on, written by the late Iraj Pezeshkzad. You see those sexual jokes, and it's a reflection of Iranian society and how, on the level of making jokes, it's always okay, but talking about sex as a serious sort of discussion is not always tolerated. But on another level, once again, social media has helped the newer generation to talk about sex, to talk about their sexual orientation in a more serious manner, not jokingly, but in a more serious manner. And it made the older generation more tolerant towards such talks.
You've also talked about the presence of taboo words and swear words being much more prevalent, like in ascendancy in recent years, as evidenced by a Tataloo concert. Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's a form of defiance. Not every form of... I don't want to put myself in the position in the judging position, so let me talk objectively. Yes, using obscene words in a Tataloo concert, for instance, is being applauded by audiences. Even though at points I realized when I was watching parts of it on YouTube that he was that's what I got, maybe I'm wrong, but he was in a way insulting some people among the audience. And yet it was applauded. And also, let's not forget that in any given culture or generation, musical community, singers and songwriters, they are rebels to the status quo, to the establishment.
But I mean, outside of the Tattoo concert, do you see that more generally, that more,
Yes,
for lack of a better term,
of
vulgar
course.
language is becoming more commonplace in Persian?
Of course. I mean, even the swear words don't have the same heavy semantic load that they used to have. Have you heard Pish Daramad? That's a song by Ali Azimi.
Of course, yes.
Yes, he uses the word F word,
Yes, the F word.
and
yes,
it's tolerated.
It's applauded. I mean, that people love that
Yes.
song. Yeah.
Yes, it's tolerated. And also other rappers like Hossein Tohi, Tumaj, Yas, they use terminology that was maybe not, used or tolerated for maybe Ebi audiences, or Gugush audiences. Yeah.
But it's interesting that I wonder if that is political, or if we see it political, because everything through the lens of Iran and Iranians, it has to be political. In other words, there's kids using vulgar language in Western music too, right? But we don't necessarily always go, oh, this must mean they're against the American state. I mean, unless they're overtly saying that. But we think that in the Iranian context. Of course, words are not as simply banned in the Western context, so that makes it more political, I suppose.
Any change in linguistic pattern that goes against theocracy or this religious imposed linguistic patterns, in my mind, is a political act.
A final couple of questions. What impact do you think the growth of Persian media and popular culture resources in the diaspora? I mean, it's a very 21st century phenomenon to have these big Iranian TV networks now and radio networks that are operating outside of Iran, well-funded, being watched in Iran and around the world. What impact is that having on the Persian language?
Of course, always there has been impact from mass media among audiences. Nowadays, I see more of a sort of interactive way in the manner they impact one another. So I mean, the older traditional outlets such as BBC Persian or Iran International. They should incorporate some of these linguistic patterns that are used in social media as well, even though they are considered as the traditional sort of media, but they have to incorporate what's been used among younger generation, even in underground culture, so underculture, So I see there is more interaction. And also, the terms that are used by people on the street, it has found its way in more traditional outlets.
Right.
For instance, the term suhtbar and kulbar. So there are smugglers who take either petroleum from Sistan Baluchistan, the province of Sistan Baluchistan, to Pakistan. Instead of calling them qachaqchi or smugglers of fuel, there is a more dignified term. There is more sympathy in the term suhtbar.
And that's relatively new?
It's a rather new term. I just heard about this term last year. Because of this corruption and this socioeconomic disparity that we see, people try to dignify them. of course, they are taking the fuel, smuggling the fuel,
Right.
but they call them suchtbar.
But it's amazing
or
how language can
kulbar.
do that, can telegraph,
Exactly.
because there is a different implication to smuggling in, out of Iran than there would be to doing so out of Canada. I mean, it's so that is fascinating. Do you a final couple of questions, and I know these are difficult ones to answer. They're sort of big picture questions, but let me throw them at you and see what you think. Do you think beyond the resistance and the defiance and the language and the vernacular and the lexicon that's come out of that, what do you think the Persian language has lost as a result of the revolution of 1979?
I don't think Persian language lost anything. It's getting more enriched by, the more experiences, the more cultural experiences we have, the more worlds that we see as language speakers, we enrich our language.
Fair to say it couldn't be killed.
No, it couldn't be killed, and I embrace change. I don't see it as a threat because, to me, a language is like an inn, a hotel. Semantic patterns, lexical patterns, even syntactic patterns that are against the so-called norm of that language may come. They may reside in this, vessel of language for a while. Some of them are going to be owned by us. So in other words, they become residents of our language. Some of them may travel and they might be forgotten. So that's the nature of any language, any human language, including Persian. Loan words come and go most of the time.
Loan words, back to the use of sort of English or something in the Persian language. Is it absurd to think that, given the rise of China as a superpower and given the proximity and the ties with Iran now, that there would be Chinese words or a Chinese effect on the Persian language in the coming decades?
I wouldn't be surprised. But you mentioned Chinese. I should also mention another Asian language that's gaining prominence in Iran among the middle class, and that's South Korean. I have heard that there are South Korean language classes in Iran nowadays, and the newer generation are crazy about Korean.
Wow.
And one of the reasons is the South Korean media. Even on Netflix here, you are going to see a whole bunch of Korean movies.
Yeah.
And because of that, Korean is gaining momentum in Iran.
Yeah, and I mean the big boy bands and all of that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What do you think? Again, these are sort of the big picture speculative questions. But what do you think would happen to the Persian language if this current regime were ever to be removed from power? Would it make a difference to the way Persians speak Persian?
Jian, I guess our previous generation made a mistake when they were they hoped for a change of regime, the Pahlavi regime, without knowing what type of regime is going to come after this one. They thought that anything is better than Shah.
Right.
So I don't want to make that speculation because it depends what type of regime. I mean, God forbid, is it going to be a more, fundamentalist regime?
Right.
Replacing this one, or are we talking about a more secularized regime? Right. Look at Farsi Dari under the Taliban. I think Farsi Dari is currently being threatened once again. I mean, I think that there is a tension, a very harsh tension between Dari and Pashto in Afghanistan at the moment. Thankfully, in Tajikistan, Tajiki is even producing more and more, works of literature. And going back to Iran, I'm not sure, honestly. No matter what happens, I think we are beyond that complete and total authority and linguistic imposition by states because of social media. So we are in social media, the newer generation are creating new linguistic patterns regardless of who is in power.
Dr. Khatereh Sheibani, I must thank you so much for all the time you've given us today. This has been enriching, educational. It's been a dynamic experience getting to talk to you about language, and thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It was my pleasure.
Khodafez.
Khoda nigahdar.
Dr. Khatereh Sheibani, an Iranian-Canadian scholar, author, and curator of Iranian cinema and Persian literature and culture. She is a professor in the Humanities Department at York University. We reached Dr. Khatereh Sheibani in Toronto, Canada today. This is full time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 32. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related to this series and our regular programs at roqemedia.com, our website, roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who make Roqe Media happen: talented Anahita, Super Parisa, Smart Pega, Ponce the Artist, Savvy Roham, Ahay Mehdad, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you have not done so already on any or all of our platforms. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. And as ever, Mizun Bashin.